today. Up next, we have Justyn Trenner from QA Financial. And Justyn, you can turn on your camera and try to get your screen share going now. Justyn's got some really cool insights into analytics and data that help drive improvement for organizations, as well as understanding, what's working and what's not working. So welcome, Justyn. Glad to have you here today.
Very good to be with you. I'm delighted to be able to share some of what we're seeing around benchmarking digital resilience.
Excellent.
So good morning, or depending where you are in the world, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you. Great to be participating in this terrific event. Very briefly, by way of background, I sometimes describe myself as an accidental technologist. I spent 25 years consulting in the financial community at a time the world was electronifying. So I developed some trading tools, some algorithmic trading tools and applications. And in the course of that, as a typical small business, I threw stuff together, and I think the fancy word for it in a small business is agile and scrums and all that kind of stuff. And then I moved to a much larger business when I sold my business, and I discovered the joys of Waterfall. I also, coming from the business side, lived and died by ROI and lots of very obvious and familiar metrics. Dial forward to today, and we see a lot of focus, a lot of regulatory focus on digital operational resilience, but less clarity on what measures you can use to prove the value of quality. ROI on quality is one of those slightly nebulous things. So I set about working with I was very lucky to be able to partner with the Bank of England, and I set about developing some standards that we could use to measure overall end-to-end return on investment in quality, measures that would show if you were improving in terms of the quality journey, how one firm compares to another, how you compare business outcomes, and indeed from a regulator's point of view, just like you can use a credit agency ratings as a shorthand for the financial viability of an institution. So could we develop a shorthand quality metric that would be easily comparable across applications and across organizations? So that was the drive for standards. As I was wrestling with this issue, so was Jordan Daniel, the domain quality lead, the head of QA and testing at the Bank of England. And he was interested for two reasons. He wanted to know how he was doing compared to others, but he also wanted to know, as a supervisor, a quick way of telling whether others were doing a good enough job. So we solved for those challenges with QA vector analytics, and in a method that I'm going to describe to you shortly, I'm delighted to say we're also partnering with Parasoft in this work. But we wanted to be able to see not just how you're doing overall for quality, but how specific areas like API testing, service virtualization contributed to that journey. What's the prize for getting this right? Well, you can see on the left side of my screen that people typically allocate around a quarter of staff time. There's not that broad a spread from the people from whom we've got data. We've got data from approaching 20 organizations, from fintechs to traditional banks, from central banks to asset managers. Typically, a quarter of staffing allocation goes on testing, but the spend on remediation, on fixing stuff that wasn't right first time out, is much broader. You can see that that spread goes from less than a fifth of all spend to a clear majority, 2/3 of all spend. And when we actually turn that on the right-hand side of the screen to quantifying it, we can see that not only are firms spending a quarter of all their spend, or sometimes more, on explicit quality efforts, but in fact the wastage as a proportion of the IT budget spent on duplicated or fixing is even greater. So as much as half of your IT budget could be wasted if you're not getting the quality journey right. So to illustrate how our metrics work, I'm going to focus on one issue which is universal across industries, and it's the shift from Waterfall to DevOps, or Waterfall to Agile and full DevOps. We've been tracking this now across more than 100 projects and programs, and I'm going to just draw a few clear lessons. First of all, I'm going to tell you something that's not true. It's not true all those times you've been told, and maybe even told people, you have to choose 2 from 3. Speed, cost, quality, pick 2, you can't have all 3. This is based on real data. What you can broadly see, the y-axis is just a straight measure of speed of delivery of the project relative to intended time for delivery. The x-axis is cost of the quality effort as a proportion of the overall dev cost, and the size of the bubble is a representation of quality. You can see that if you get the model right, you get all 3. And what does good look like? Well, what good looks like is not absolutely waterfall, it's not absolutely DevOps, but it's actually a lesson that I learned from talking to the CTO of the Red Bull Racing Formula One team. You do DevOps where it's appropriate, but you definitely do lockbox final hard testing before it goes on the car. And so you do for major payments and other applications. The hybrid model turns out to be the most effective model, both for more recent developed organizations and for established organizations. So a couple of lessons that sit behind that. We get data from our participants on their defect escapes. Slightly counterintuitively, the yellow triangles, left-facing triangles, are the associated with the organizations that perform best on the previous slide. And that was the fintechs using a hybrid model. You'll see they score very well overall for defect escape, but when you break that down, they score really well for trivial defects. In other words, they don't let too many trivial defects escape, but they score apparently very poorly for critical defects. They allow critical defects to escape. Now that seems counterintuitive, but what lies behind that is a fix fast ethic. Have a release date and have a release date too that's only a few days later, and allow your users to be your testers. Fix fast. And also the second lesson that comes out of that is the old style 4-point scale, where you differentiated between trivial because they didn't stop the application and catastrophic because they stopped the application. That's the wrong scale. Stopping the application and forcing a reboot, we're all used to with our mobile phones. That's not a big deal. Not stopping the application but allowing data to leak, that's a disaster. So the old 4-point scale doesn't actually work anymore. We have to rethink that. So where does that bring us back to? Well, that brings us to an overall efficiency score. So forget the trade-off of the 3. You'll see that we on this slide present a y-axis that is overall quality performance. So if we focus on things like defect escapes, on-time delivery, and the amount of effort that had to go into remediation as the balanced scorecard inputs for the execution score. The x-axis is the spend score. We focus on how much of your IT spend went on testing and quality assurance, and how much of it went on remediation, again, as a proportion of the overall spend. By the way, we have methodologies to apply this kind of thinking, whether you're using a DevOps continuous cycle or whether you're using a waterfall discrete project approach. And then the size of the bubble is simply the ratio, how much quality execution you're getting per spend. Couple of observations, very, very clear on our screen. First of all, you'll notice that the dots form a 45-degree angle. And you'll notice that in broad terms, the size of the dots is in proportion to their height up that slope. Really simple, clear-cut lesson. get your quality model right, and you get all three. You get an effective spend, which your CFO should be pleased about. You get better quality, and you get effective execution. Get the model wrong, you slide down the scale, and you see quality suffer, as well as timeliness and other attributes. So what have we seen that people do wrong? Well, they shift to DevOps thinking they can fire their quality experts or think they can just turn them into developers. And that leads to a lack of testing expertise and a high cost of fixing because they've got the most expensive engineers doing all the fixing. Conversely, what's the right approach? Don't try and reduce the spend as you shift to DevOps. Just spend it smarter and differently. Use proper benchmark tools to focus the spend. And then there's something which, of course, is becoming very much a conversation and the use of AI. Don't run every test slavishly every time you have a drop. Work out which tests are needed for which drops. And that is a key part of efficiency. So we're seeing the need to maintain spend, but spend smarter. We're seeing that API testing and fixing can account for double the cost per defect than other kinds of defects. So we need to really look at that and see what the API story is, how we can be most effective at monitoring API defects, root cause analysis, and also what are the tests that you need to run when you fix API challenges. We are beginning to examine pickup from service virtualization and apply our metrics for that. We're also looking at data provisioning as a key source of wastage. Duplicated spending because different groups organize and structure the same set of data more than once for different tests. And also poor test data leads to the wrong tests with the wrong outcomes. So data provisioning is a key source of wastage and poor outcomes and fixing in production. So just coming back to what we're doing with QA Vector Analytics, we would invite everybody who's listening in to undertake a free of charge proof of concept as part of our relationship with Parasoft. The data that you would need to provide us for proof of concept is fairly light and relates to the effort that you put into development and testing and remediation, with estimates where necessary, where you don't capture the data in that way, along with defect escape and project timeliness data. And when we work with people on long term, of course, we develop scripts to extract data, transform it, normalize it, and upload it into our data set. We'd be happy to undertake, as I say, a proof of concept with anybody who's participating on this event, and we'll deliver via our web delivered platform. Where we're going next with this is analysis of the value added by different vendors that you may be using, but particularly predictive analytics. So we're starting, like everybody else, to apply machine learning and AI. And we're using it to identify, for example, in a recent deliverable, as a solution went into production, we were able to give the financial institution concerned an indication of the range of expected incidents and defects they should see in production and the amount of remediation resource they should allocate for that major program based on their recent experience. So please contact me or indeed your Parasoft relationship manager to find out more about undertaking a proof of concept. Now, I've taken you quite rapidly through the concept here. I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thanks, Justyn. There's a couple of things One is if someone's trying to get started, like where they're going to get their biggest bang for their buck, right? Like they're trying to do this transformation. You've got all these analytics, so without going into a specific deep dive of someone's actual problems, but how do people get started?
Well, one of the things that people often set about doing when they're going through a transformation is they set about shifting their operating model. The shift of operating model, it can be from most obviously going from a waterfall modality to an agile mode, but it can also be increasing the amount that you're outsourcing, or conversely, insourcing, bringing back programs in-house. And very often there is a lot of, let's say, internal debate about how to apply those models. So as an example of an outcome, we saw one organization that decided to give responsibility for accessibility all the way through the organization. Everybody should be a true believer in full digital accessibility. And our point of contact was able to use our analytics to highlight the key points of failure with that model. There was nothing wrong with the model, but clearly there was a lack of training throughout the development cycle, with the result that there was a high defect escape, and they were very expensive to fix because you were using full-on developers to fix a lot of trivial defects. Similarly, we were able to show one organization in transition that the outsourced development company that they were using, they were actually using two outsourced development companies, and one of them was driving a much higher level of inefficiency than the other. And the two outsourced development companies were owned by, we could say, divisional CTOs. The relationships were owned by divisional CTOs. And it allowed the overall CTO to provide some evidence of why they should consider unifying the program under one supplier. So model is a very effective way of going about using our analytics.
Great, thanks. There was a question around, can you expand a bit on how hybrid DevOps and Waterfall model is utilized?
Sure. So let me try and give an example that will probably speak to a wide range of the audience. Typically, we can think of front-end applications and back-end systems that connect to those front-end applications, and I think that's a description that we could apply in a lot of places. Anything that connects to a core banking system or a core telco system, the front end, you can use DevOps very effectively, very rapid development, get feedback, go through the cycles of sprints, and get that front-end application working well. The back end needs to work when it's put into production. The front end, there can be the odd glitch that doesn't work quite as expected. So historically, we might have expected the front-end application to be very traditionally waterfall based and then connected to the back end and the whole thing delivered to the business as one piece. Now what we might expect to see is the front end developed close work with the business, then the connection to the back end, and that being tested in a rather traditional waterfall method, so that before you go into production, you would summarize the whole thing as having had a hybrid delivery experience.
All right, well, thanks. We appreciate it, Justyn. It's been a great talk. If we have any further questions, we'll get them in the feed to you, but we appreciate you joining us today. I know it's later in your day than for us, but it's been fantastic. And as Justyn mentioned, feel free to contact him or us. He's got some POCs available so you can see how the stuff will work for you, what you can learn, and how to apply it and improve what you're doing. So thanks again, Justyn, and we will now move on to the next person.